The Whispering Shadows. It was a cold and moonless night when the storm came. The wind howled through the trees like a wailing ghost, and rain lashed at the windows of the old, abandoned mansion that stood on the outskirts of town. No one had lived there for decades, and the locals whispered that the place was cursed. Yet, there were always those who didn't believe in such things, and tonight, a group of friends found themselves daring each other to spend the night in the mansion. Lena, Mark, Julia, and Evan were used to the thrill of ghost stories, but none of them could have predicted the nightmare they were about to awaken. They entered the mansion just after sunset, the door creaking open as if it had been waiting for them. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned beneath their feet. They explored room after room, each one colder and more decayed than the last. The mansion had been forgotten, its furniture rotting, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper. But it was the silence that unnerved them most, a silence that seemed to press against their ears, making it hard to think. As they made their way up to the attic, they noticed something strange. A small, old-fashioned rocking chair sat in the middle of the room, rocking slowly, despite the lack of any breeze. At first, they laughed it off. Maybe it was the wind pushing through the cracks, they reasoned. But the chair didn't stop. It rocked faster, its creaks turning to ominous groans. Then, a voice, low, almost imperceptible, whispered through the room. "Leave now." The friends froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. They turned to each other, wide-eyed, but no one had spoken. They looked back at the chair. It stopped rocking, but something in the room had changed. The air felt heavier, suffocating, and a sense of dread filled their hearts. They tried to leave, but the stairs had vanished. Instead of a door leading back down, they found only a vast, black hallway stretching endlessly in front of them. Panic set in. They stumbled backward, trying to find any way out, but the mansion seemed to shift around them. The walls twisted and closed in. Shadows began to stretch and distort, forming grotesque shapes that lurked in the corners of their vision. Then they heard it, the whispers. At first, it was just one voice, low and haunting. But soon, more voices joined in, speaking in a language they couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were coming from the very walls. Desperate to escape, they ran blindly through the dark corridors, but the mansion seemed to trap them, always leading them back to the same place, the attic. Lena screamed as something cold and bony touched her shoulder. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Yet the sensation remained, creeping up her spine. As she backed away, her foot struck something, an old mirror, cracked and covered in grime. She wiped it clean, and what she saw sent a shock of terror through her. In the reflection, they weren't alone. A shadowy figure stood behind them, its eyes glowing red, its face twisted in agony. It raised a hand, beckoning them closer. "Help us," the figure whispered, its voice coming not from the mirror, but from all around them. The group tried to run, but they were too late. The shadows swallowed them whole, dragging them into the dark abyss of the mansion. Their screams echoed through the empty halls, but no one outside could hear. The next morning, when the storm had passed, the mansion stood silent once more. The door remained open, as if waiting for someone to enter. But no one did. The four friends were never found, and the town moved on, telling the tale of the lost souls who had dared to awaken the spirits of the mansion. But if you listen carefully, on certain nights, you can still hear the faint whispering coming from the ruins. Leave now. The Whispering Shadows, Part 2. Months passed since the disappearance of Lena, Mark, Julia, and Evan. The mansion had become a place of fearful curiosity for the townsfolk, yet no one dared approach it. Whispers of the cursed house grew louder, its tragic history resurfacing. The authorities had declared the search for the missing friends as fruitless. No one had ever found a trace of them, but that didn't stop people from talking. One cold evening, a new group of thrill-seekers arrived in the town. For friends, Nick, Sarah, David, and Emily had heard the stories of the mansion and laughed them off as mere superstition. Having spent countless nights in supposedly haunted locations, they were convinced they could solve the mystery of the Whispering Shadows. Their decision to visit the mansion was fueled by both excitement and arrogance. What they didn't know was that they were about to unleash something far darker than they could ever imagine. As they made their way to the mansion, the sky was overcast, a thick fog settling over the ground. The wind had died down, but a strange stillness hung in the air. Nick, the most daring of the group, was the first to approach the front door. He pushed it open, the ancient hinges squealing in protest, and gestured for the others to follow. "I'm not scared," he said, though there was a slight tremor in his voice. "This is going to be one hell of a night." They entered the mansion, and immediately, an eerie sense of unease filled the air. The floorboards creaked under their weight, and dust swirled around them like the ghosts of forgotten memories. Unlike the stories they had heard, the mansion wasn't completely decayed. There was an unnatural stillness, as if it were waiting for something. As they explored the lower floors, they found nothing unusual, just the remnants of an old, abandoned home. They laughed off the strange sensations, blaming it on their nerves. But it wasn't long before they reached the stairs leading to the attic. The temperature dropped noticeably, their breath becoming visible in the air. David, who had been quiet until now, shivered as they reached the top of the staircase. "This feels wrong," he whispered. "We should leave." "Don't be such a baby," Emily teased, but there was uncertainty in her eyes. At the top of the stairs, they saw it, the rocking chair, just like in the stories. It stood motionless in the center of the room. But the shadows in the room seemed deeper, darker than they remembered from their brief glance before. Nick stepped forward confidently and, with a mocking grin, sat down in the chair. As soon as he did, the air around them seemed to grow heavier, thick with an oppressive force. The chair began to rock, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, creaking loudly. "All right, enough," Sarah said, her voice shaky as she grabbed Nick's arm, attempting to pull him up. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. The room seemed to darken, even though the window was clear and the moonlight should have flooded in. Shadows in the corners of the room began to shift. The whispers began. "Leave." The sound was faint, but unmistakable. "Leave." It grew louder, more distinct. There was no mistaking it now. The voice came from all around them, low and menacing, like 1,000 voices speaking as one. David's eyes widened. It's not just a voice. It's something else." The shadows in the room began to stretch, twisting into shapes too horrible to comprehend. Figures with distorted faces and hollow eyes, moving slowly, painfully toward them. As they drew closer, the friends could hear the scraping sound of skeletal limbs dragging across the floor. "Run!" Emily screamed, her voice breaking. She grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the stairs. But the shadows followed, moving with terrifying speed, filling the doorway and blocking the exit. There was no escape. Nick stood frozen, staring at something in the distance, his face pale with terror. "They're here," he whispered. "They've come back for us." The figures in the room began to speak, their voices a cacophony of suffering. "Help us." One moaned. "Save us." Another cried. The shadows lunged at Nick, their skeletal hands grabbing him, pulling him toward the center of the room. His body jerked violently as if he were being dragged through the floor itself. The others screamed, but their voices were swallowed by the growing cacophony. In that moment, Emily realized the truth. The mansion wasn't just haunted. It was a trap. A prison for souls, forever bound to the darkness, forever whispering to lure others in. Sarah, trembling, grabbed a broken shard of glass from the shattered mirror lying in the corner. With one swift motion, she slashed at the shadows. The air exploded with a deafening wail, and for a brief second, the shadows recoiled, but only for a moment. The mansion seemed to groan, a deep, rumbling sound like the earth itself was waking up. "Run!" Emily shouted. But the ground beneath them trembled as if the very mansion was alive, and they were caught in its grip. It wasn't just a house, it was a sentient thing, feeding on fear, drawing strength from those it trapped. As they ran down the hallway, the whispers grew into shrieks, loud enough to make their ears ring. Their footsteps echoed against the walls, but no matter how far they ran, they couldn't escape the darkness closing in. The house seemed to stretch, pulling them deeper into its heart, where the shadows waited. Suddenly, a bright flash of light exploded in front of them. Blinded, they staggered back, unable to see. And then, silence. When the light faded, the mansion was gone. There was no attic. No hallway. Just a vast, empty void, stretching endlessly in all directions. The shadows circled around them, their eyes glowing, their whispers now a roar in their ears. "Welcome to our home." The friends fell to their knees, their screams swallowed by the infinite darkness, as the mansion's curse claimed them, one by one. Outside, the wind began to howl again. The Whispering Shadows, Part 3. The storm raged outside, its howling winds a reminder of the storm that had once preceded the arrival of the first group of lost souls. But within the mansion, there was only silence now. The air was thick with a presence that pressed against the walls, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The mansion had swallowed them whole, but it didn't seem content yet. It waited, biding its time, as if something even darker than the shadows still lingered in the corners. Days passed, though it was hard to say how many. Time seemed meaningless in the mansion. The sun had not risen. The sky had not changed. The only thing that remained constant was the whispering, the voices, always just beyond comprehension. The friends who had come in search of a thrill had now become part of the house's twisted collection. But something was different. This time, the house was not just hungry for fear. It was desperate. In the deepest, forgotten recesses of the mansion, beneath layers of dust and crumbling wood, there was a door that had been closed for years. It had been locked, sealed by chains so old that they barely clung to the door's frame, rusted and brittle. The house had kept this door hidden for a reason, and though it had long since lost its purpose, it could no longer resist. It had waited too long. The door was opening. Sarah awoke first. Her eyes fluttered open, though the world around her was bathed in an unsettling twilight. Her limbs were heavy, and her head pounded, but she wasn't sure if that was from the darkness or the shadows still clinging to her thoughts. As she sat up, her hands brushed against something cold and wet. Was she lying in the wet dirt? Her breath caught in her throat. The walls of the mansion had disappeared. The familiar, oppressive atmosphere was gone. She was no longer in the attic or the hallway. Instead, she was standing at the edge of a vast cavern, the ground beneath her made of cracked stone, stretching far and wide. It was the heart of the house, its true form, its ancient core. And there, across the dark abyss, was the door. The one that had been sealed for centuries. She wasn't alone. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw Emily standing next to her, staring at the door as if hypnotized by it. Where are we?" Sarah whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the cavernous space. "This wasn't here before." "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice distant. I think we've crossed into something else. Something worse than the house." The ground trembled beneath their feet as a low rumble filled the cavern. It was as though the very air around them was alive with hunger. The whispers had turned into a soft hum, vibrating through their bones. They felt a growing presence, an immense, dark force awakening deep within the earth. Then, it spoke. "Help me." The voice was deep, resonant, and it came from all directions. The shadows in the cavern shifted, twisting and curling around them. In the center of the room, the door began to open slowly, creaking loudly, as if the rusted chains were being undone one by one. "What is that?" Emily gasped. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her heart racing. "But we have to stop it. We can't let it open." But there was no way to stop it. The door opened wider, revealing the darkness beyond. A deep, hollow space, where even the shadows themselves seemed to fear to tread. It was like looking into the heart of nothingness, an abyss that stretched on forever, and yet something stirred there, something ancient and terrifying. Then, it stepped through. A figure emerged from the blackness, tall and shadowy, its form shifting and changing as it moved. It was a being made of darkness itself, its features indistinguishable, its movements fluid and unnatural. Its face was not a face at all, just an empty space where eyes should have been, where a mouth should have been. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The moment it crossed into their world, the ground shook violently. The shadows thickened and began to spread, reaching out like tendrils, wrapping around Sarah and Emily, pulling them closer toward the figure. "No. No." Sarah screamed as she struggled against the shadows, but they tightened their grip, making it impossible to move. She could feel their icy cold fingers crawling over her skin. And then she realized this thing wasn't just the heart of the mansion. It was the mansion itself. The walls that had once stood tall were now shattered, crumbling into nothingness. The mansion had been nothing more than a shell, a prison to contain this creature for centuries. And now that the door had been opened, it was free. The whispers returned, louder now, ringing in their ears, a cacophony of voices. Help us. Release us. Join us. The shadows pressed in from all sides. It was too late to run. Too late to escape. From behind her, Sarah heard another voice, faint, but familiar. Sarah. She turned, her heart pounding, her breath caught in her throat. Lena. Lena, Mark, Julia, and Evan. They were there, floating in the darkness, their faces pale and distorted, their eyes empty, as if they were no longer human. They reached out, their hands stretching toward her, their voices pleading. Join us, Sarah. It's the only way to survive. Become part of the house, Emily echoed, her voice distant, her eyes glazed. But Sarah refused. She fought against the shadows, against the voices, against the thing that had taken them all. With one final scream, she pulled free, stumbling backward, away from the abyss. But the mansion, no, the entity, would not let her go. The shadows roared, swallowing her once more, dragging her into the heart of the darkness, where there would be no escape. Where time and space had no meaning. And as the door to the abyss slammed shut, the cavern fell silent once again. For now, there would be no more whispers. But the mansion was still hungry. And it waited. Somewhere, in the distance, a new group of souls would hear the call. Help us. The whispering shadows, conclusion. The mansion stood in the darkness, silent once more, its secrets buried deep within its crumbling walls. The whispers had ceased, but the presence of the house lingered, its hunger unsatisfied. 4 years, it would wait, patiently watching, listening for the next souls daring enough to enter its cursed domain. The town, now a distant memory, continued to grow and change, unaware of the horrors just beyond its edge. Life moved on. But sometimes, on cold, moonless nights, when the wind howled through the trees and the fog rolled in thick and heavy, the townsfolk would speak in hushed tones about the place. They would tell the story of those who had entered and never returned. They would warn their children to stay far away from the mansion at the edge of the woods. But no one ever listened. And eventually, one evening, another group of curious souls arrived. They had heard the rumors, of course. They knew about the lost friends, about the terrible stories passed down over the years. But they were skeptical. They thought it was all a joke, a tale spun to frighten the weak. There were 5 of them this time, new faces, fresh blood. Confident and full of bravado, they stood at the gates of the mansion, their laughter breaking the stillness of the night. They dared each other to go inside, to face whatever haunted the house, believing they could outsmart whatever dark force had claimed so many before them. But the house, the mansion, it had been waiting for them. The moment they crossed the threshold, the air thickened. The doors slammed shut behind them, as if the house itself had exhaled a sigh of satisfaction. They ventured deeper, exploring the empty halls, unaware of the fate that awaited them. And then they reached the attic. The same attic. The same rocking chair. The same suffocating silence. Only this time, the whispers had not died. They were stronger, more insistent. They wrapped around the newcomers like a noose. Leave. It was a voice they recognized, a voice they had heard in their dreams, in their nightmares. It was not just the wind anymore. It was something else. The shadows shifted in the corners, and the door to the cavern, the heart of the mansion, creaked open, just as it had so many years ago. And from the dark abyss beyond, the figure stepped through. The door had been opened once again. The mansion's hunger had never been sated. It was not the building that was alive, but the darkness itself. And now, there were new souls to claim. The figure moved toward them slowly, its hollow eyes glowing red with anticipation. The newcomers screamed. The shadows reached out for them. And as the last echo of their cries faded, the mansion stood silent again. The door was sealed. The shadows receded. For now, the house would rest. But it was only a matter of time before the whispers returned. And the next group would come.